Algebra lesson 2-8. Probability. The probability of an event. An event is something that's taking place. It is the measure of likelihood that it will actually occur, that it will actually happen. And that probability is going to be between 0 meaning that it will not happen at all, and 1, that it certainly will happen. If we take something pretty simple like flipping a coin, usually there's a heads and a tails, so the fact that you would get heads should theoretically happen half of the time. So the probability of getting heads would be halfway between 0 and 1. Now, if I have a special coin that has heads on both sides, a double-headed quarter, which is obviously pretty rare, but if I had one, then the probability of flipping a tails would be 0, because there wasn't one of those options. But the probability of flipping a heads would then be a 1, because both sides are heads. So probability of an event. Now we have a little saying for helping us to remember probability. I always remember it as fav over pos. Fav stands for favorable. Favorable is what you want. So what do you want as an outcome? That would go on top. If you wanted to know how many heads would happen, that would go on top. If you want to know how many tails, that would go on top. Possible is what could happen. What possibilities are there? Just because what you want doesn't necessarily match with what there could be. So favorable over possible is a way to remember probability. All right? Outcomes. The outcomes are the different possible results. That's what would go down here. Flipping a coin has 2 possible outcomes, a head and a tails. A regular 6-sided die is going to have 6 different possible results. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. All right? So the outcomes that you could get, those are right here. And the event. An event itself is a collection. Remember, a collection is a group of these outcomes. Maybe you're rolling dice over and over again, and you're collecting the data. Roll number 1, this was the result. Roll number 2, this was the result. Roll number 3, this was the result. The collection of that would be considered an event. All right, favorable outcomes are the outcomes you wish to have happen and what you want to have happen. So I talked about that with our saying of fav over pos. Fav is just an abbreviation of favorable. Remember, the outcomes are what you would get as a result, or possibilities. We want the favorable ones, the ones that we're trying to achieve. Shooting a basket, I mean, there's basically 2 options. It goes in or it goes out. The favorable one would be that it goes in. So I'd like to see how many of my favorable outcomes I had compared to what the possibilities were. Now, there's a different form of probabilities. This is theoretical. And that's a little bit more what we were talking about a moment ago with our favorable over possible, or fav over pos. Theoretical is what it would be in theory. In theory, if you flipped heads, the next time you'd flip tails. The next time heads, the next time's tails. Heads, tails, heads, tails, heads, tails. And it would be nice and even, theoretically. Because theoretically, it has equal chance for both sides to come up as a result. But we know that that's not necessarily true. All right? You could flip the coin for an hour, maybe, and get mostly heads. It all depends. But in theory, it's even. It's fair, so that everybody gets an equal shot at it. So here is the number of favorable outcomes. So this is the theoretical probability, what we want to have happen over what could happen. And that's where the fav over pos comes from. Most of what we deal with will be theoretical probability. What it would be in a nice, fair, vacuum, nothing affecting these outcomes, just what it would be in a theoretical standpoint, in theory, in other words, what we would say should happen. Not a guarantee, but what should happen. All right? But there is also experimental probability. And this is different because it's actually an experiment. So you're actually rolling the die. You're actually flipping the coin. It's possible you could flip the coin 100 times and maybe 70 of them were heads and 30 of them were tails. I mean, I doubt it would be that much, but it could. And if that's the case, the number of favorable outcomes, if you were flipping the coin and you wanted to know what the experimental probability was for flipping heads, you'd put the 70 favorable heads over the 100 tries. Now that's going to give you 7 out of 10, or 70%. Theoretical probability would say it's 50%, so that there's a major variation there. But again, it's because it was an experiment, and the experiment may or may not be exactly the same as theoretical. However, the longer you conduct the experiment, in the beginning it may seem like it's skewed, but the longer you actually do the experiment, the closer and closer and closer it will become to matching the theoretical probability. All right, and lastly, we have what we call odds. This usually throws people for a loop. They're pretty good with probability, but odds messes them up. The difference between odds and probability, you still have your favorable outcomes on top, the fave, but you're not comparing it to what could happen. You're going to compare it to what you don't want to happen. So if we were to say that the probability, remember this is different, this is not odds, the probability of heads on a coin, the probability of heads is 1 favorable out of 2 possible. The odds of heads is what you want still out of what you don't want. It's 1 to 1. So it's a little different. This one compares what you want to what could be, and odds compares what you want to what you don't want. So you need to be aware of that. Sometimes people get tricked on this because they're not sure how things work. Just remember, odds is a comparison of good to bad in a way. And probability is a comparison of good to anything, all of it, what it could be. If you know the odds, then you should know the total possible. Because the odds is comparing good to bad. If you add the good and the bad together, it should equal the total possibilities. So if you're ever given the odds of something, you should be able to figure out the probability fairly easy. If you just add the 2 numbers together, you'll have your possible number on the bottom. So just keep that in mind.